Hello, welcome to another edition of the DAV Podcast. I'm Jonathan Kaupanger. Today we're talking about veteran suicide, but this episode isn't about dwelling on the despair associated with suicide. It's about highlighting lethal means safety as a way of saving lives. Lethal means are anything someone experiencing a suicide crisis can use to harm themselves. They include things like medication, alcohol, drugs, ropes, sharp objects, and the item most often used in the veteran community, guns. Lethal means safety is a simple concept meant to put more time and distance between a person in suicidal crisis and their access to objects that pose a danger to themselves. With me today to talk about this is clinical psychologist Dr. Russell Lemle. Dr. Lemle is a co-founder and senior policy analyst for the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. He has authored several scientific articles on the prevention of firearm suicide for publications including Task and Purpose, Guns and Ammo, and the California Firing Line. He's recognized by the American Psychological Association and the Association of VA Psychologist Leaders for his lifetime achievements regarding veterans' healthcare policy and firearm suicide prevention. Dr. Lemle is also the recipient of the 2020 Disabled American Veterans Special Recognition Award for Veteran Healthcare Advocacy. Dr. Lemle, thank you for being here with us today.
And thank you, Jonathan, for having me.
Before we really get into this, I like to talk about something that potentially causes veterans to not look for help at the VA. I think it's something like 45% of veterans own firearms compared to 30% of our civilian counterparts. But veterans like their guns, but there's a myth that the VA is going to take away our guns if we go there for help. You've worked both in and outside the VA. Is there any truth to this?
You're absolutely right. That myth is very prevalent. A third of veterans believe it, and a quarter of veterans won't seek VA healthcare, especially mental health, because of that myth. And yet, as the word demonstrates, it is a myth. There's never been and there is no confiscation of firearms in going to the VA. But historically, there was a small sliver of veterans who were found in need of a fiduciary to handle their money, to handle their monthly VA disability checks. And they were being reported to the National Background Check System. But new laws passed so that that is no longer true. So the bottom line is, it is a myth, no confiscation. And really, what's important about understanding that it's a myth is to please get the help that you need.
If you need it, they're going to help you no matter what.
That's true. Yes.
So I haven't used the VA yet, but my medical doctor, who is an Air Force veteran, insists that I connect to the VA, especially when it comes to my mental health. Why should vets seek care delivered by the VA?
First, studies repeatedly show that the quality of VA care, kind of across the board, is as good or better than private sector care. VA care is veteran specific in terms of the expertise of the providers, understanding of military-related conditions like PTSD, MST, traumatic brain injury, substance use, and so forth. The VA has higher quality standards in terms of the care that's provided and the training of the providers than exists in the private sector. VA care is more integrated. All of the providers can talk to one another. In the private sector, it's fragmented. And then going back to your opening question, why they should seek it, I just want to kind of reiterate, is that if we know that 20% of veterans don't go to the VA only because of the issue of fear of their guns being confiscated, that's another good reason to go, because that isn't going to happen.
So if the VA is so good at dealing with veterans and our medical issues, then what's the logic in sending veterans out to community care? Community care is a big thing at DAV. We're watching this a lot, but civilian doctors don't have the background to deal with veterans the way military and VA doctors are trained. Do you have any, I hate to put you on the spot, but do you have any foresight in how community care will affect veteran suicide?
Well, let me take both parts of that question. The logic behind community care is about access. Sometimes community care is faster, although many times it's not. And sometimes the private sector hospital is closer, though not always. So those are kind of favorable reasons. And as you said, why DAV is interested in community care, because it kind of provides more access in those situations. As to the other part of your question about preventing veteran suicide, it will take an all hands on deck, all of nation approach to make inroads. And anytime community care can supplement VA's care to reach more veterans, that's progress. I do want, though, to just mention that the studies of veteran suicide deaths is that there are higher rates of suicide deaths among veterans who exclusively receive community care than those receiving the VA. And I'll just underscore this. The VA has the single best suicide prevention program in the country.
Okay, well, let's talk a little, at least one part of that. Can you summarize the reasoning behind counseling an at-risk veteran to voluntarily and temporarily reduce access to their own gun?
A couple decades ago, we learned some important facts about suicide that debunked the myth of the inevitability of suicide death once the intention is there. First is the intensity and the impulse fluctuates. Half of survivors of a serious suicide attempt report it took them less than 10 minutes between the final decision, I'm going to act, and the act itself. Second and related is that studies that have tracked survivors of suicide attempts found that 2/3 never, ever attempted again, meaning that for anyone who is making a serious attempt, if there's any way that we can delay it or thwart it, the majority of those individuals aren't really kind of permanently suicidal. It's not inevitable. In fact, just the opposite. Relatedly, we know that homes where firearms are securely stored have lower suicide rates than homes where guns are not stored securely. And so based on kind of all of this research, the strategy was developed to, as you correctly mentioned, was to create time and space that it would take to reach a firearm when an impulse surges. And I'm also glad that you used the word voluntary and temporary, because the whole lethal means safety strategy, the whole effort that we're talking about here is voluntary and it is temporary. And I'm only emphasizing that because there's often apprehension that that isn't really true.
Now, I know around 2011, the VA started giving away gun locks. Are they still doing that? Is that working?
Yes and no, Jonathan. The VA still does offer free cable locks to firearm owners, and you just have to ask and you will get one for free. We also know that cable locks are not the preferred type of locking device for most firearm owners, who overwhelmingly favor using lock boxes and safes. And knowing that, the VA a year ago started a pilot to distribute lock boxes to veterans who are at moderate to high risk and request one from their provider. And then even more recently is that pilot is being expanded and rolled out kind of in more locations.
So a veteran just has to go to their provider and say, I'm struggling with some mental health issues. I would like a lockbox for my gun.
That is true. Although, as I say, because this is still a new program, it's conceivable that the provider who that veteran goes to may not even be caught up with what I just said. But if they just indicate that this is a program being rolled out, I think they would succeed.
Lethal means safety seems like it's putting all the responsibility on the person who's depressed or struggling. I know when I'm depressed, I don't want anybody telling me what to do. So how do you convince somebody that they need to do this? And also, is there a role for friends and family, or is this discussion just for one's healthcare provider and the person?
Again, let me take the two parts of your question. In these conversations, we're not trying to convince an individual. I think it's important to understand that any of those conversations are a two-way conversation. Related to that, I just want to make sure that family and friends understand that don't be afraid to bring up the topic, because you can never put an idea in anyone's head that isn't already there. And I think I say that because there's often hesitation that you're doing just that. But you won't be putting the idea in someone's head. Yeah, and family and friends absolutely have a role to play, as also do mental health professionals. This is a both and situation. And that these conversations, if you enter into them, if you treat it with the sensitivity that issues like suicide and firearms have for individuals, understand that trust is kind of central to engaging in a way so that whoever you talk to about this feels some trust in where you're coming from. And in doing that, you can save a life.
So on that saving lives, my brother died by suicide when I was serving in Italy. I knew he had problems, but I wasn't there to help. I was on the other side of the world. I had another friend, he was my best friend, a veteran, who also died by suicide. He was living on the West Coast while I was living on the East Coast at the time. In both cases, I knew something was up, but I wasn't close enough to really do anything with any of them. Veterans, we have friends all over the world, and distance adds an amount of helplessness when we know someone is suffering. What should people do in a case like this?
Yeah, and what you're saying makes total sense, Jonathan. I mean, it had to make you feel helpless
Yeah.
when you're at such a distance, and for anyone else in your situation. So you're describing it exactly right. And of course, if you can't be there in person, you shouldn't hesitate to use video, to use telephone. Use what is available. It obviously isn't kind of all or nothing by any stretch. If you're able doing that to validate your friend's suffering, you listen. The importance is something that you take seriously in terms of how they're feeling. You can't take away their pain, but you can be caring and concerned, and that really can make a difference. But there's also really another part of what you're implying, which is that there's grief on the other side of suicide loss. People in situations like yourself have to cope with and get through the healing from going through these tragic losses. So I would also just kind of add to the notion that we're talking about peers having conversations with those who are struggling with suicidal impulses, and suicidal ideation, is to also be thinking that we need to intervene and come to the help of those who have actually been on the other side of these tragic losses, and not just in the immediate aftermath of a suicide death. This could take a while. There's a word for it, which isn't the important piece. It's called postvention, but it really just points to the fact that there are a lot of sufferers that are involved in these situations.
Yeah, it definitely takes a while when it's that close to deal with what happened and to figure out where you're going to go next. Yeah, that did take a while. I'd like to talk about some laws for a second. Nothing is specifically, unless you know of some, but I know that there have been a few bills introduced to help fight veteran suicide, including some specifically geared to lethal means safety. Is there anything coming from our lawmakers that's going to help address this problem?
There are a few. So let me just briefly summarize. On the House side, Chris Deluzio introduced a bill that was bipartisan in the introduction, and also had the support of the National Shooting Sports Foundation. It was introduced last fall, that was taking the VA's kind of more limited lockbox kind of innovation pilot that I was talking about earlier, and to really expand and broaden that so that it can reach kind of the vast majority of veterans who have some interest in more secure storage, knowing that a large percentage of them don't have lockboxes that they would use if they could afford to have one. So this would be the VA distributing. Senator Angus King on the Senate side introduced some similar legislation that I just described. And I know that two of them are talking and trying to come up with common language for this Congress that they will kind of try to be moving forward. And as I said, there already is kind of bipartisan support and firearm industry support. There's another bill from Clay Higgins, who's a representative from Louisiana, which is also related to this, but in an entirely different way, which is trying to provide liability protection for retailers who store anyone's firearm and then return it to its rightful owner, and that firearm is then used in a suicide. And Higgins' legislation would provide immunity for the retailers in those situations. And the only reason that's important is that the vast majority of retailers do not like to and do not allow storage in these situations because they're afraid that if something untoward happens after the return, that they could be liable. So this is a way to take away what that overarching fear is, to incentivize kind of more out-of-home storage.
One last question before we go. Can we spend a few minutes and talk about the language we can use when speaking with friends and family if we're concerned that they may be at risk for suicide?
Yeah, and I'm going to just start with what I said earlier, which is the language that it's voluntary and temporary is very important. I think when you're talking with somebody, you probably would do this anyway, but you bring a flexibility to these conversations. You see what's acceptable, see what's preferred by the individual. It's definitely not one size fits all, and it's got to be kind of a collaborative conversation that takes where that other person is into account. As I said a moment ago, out-of-home storage in a temporary fashion is, of course, the safest to increase kind of the time and space that it would take for an individual who might have an impulse to act. But out-of-home storage is often not acceptable. Then we're talking about additional barriers in-home that increase prevention. Any incremental reduction reduces the risk of dying. And if possible, you want to involve trusted family members or friends that you want to see this as a collective effort. And I think finally, I would, on that same note, I would remind the individual that their family needs them. That one of the ways that you can keep your family safe is for you to be safe.
Dr. Russell Lemle, thank you so much for being with us today. This subject it's a rough subject to talk about. It's nice to have just another tool to use because you feel hopeless a lot of times.
Right. And let me just add to what you were just saying, Jonathan, which is we're trying to create just time and distance because many times the impulse is just kind of a momentary overwhelm that goes right into then the action. And if we can get somebody through that window of time, that's kind of how you save lives.
We understand that this conversation may be difficult for some listeners. So if you're a veteran struggling with thoughts of suicide, please reach out for help. The Veterans Crisis Line is a confidential resource available around the clock. Call 988 and press 1 or text 838-255. And if you'd like more information on lethal means safety, go to mentalhealth.va.gov/suicide prevention/lethal means. And as always, thank you for your service and sacrifice. We truly appreciate your time and dedication to our country. This has been the DAV Podcast. I'm Jonathan Kaupanger. Until next time, bye for now.